When Fear is Not Afraid, the fourth Velvet Paw of Asquith novel, and the first in the Morrigan trilogy, by Thomas Caulfield. Read by the author. Chapter 2. The doors of the underground train hissed open. From carriages, passengers spilled. There was jostling when waiting animals pushed through to replace them, both parties grateful not to need their pillows. It was a busy time of evening. Those disembarking were eager to get home, as were those trying to board. One in particular. The returned poet hopped from paw to paw, waiting for the alighting bolus to lessen. When the station he sought was announced over the platform's loudspeakers, he could wait no longer, and fought through the throng, ignoring the indignant swipes of those just as eager to board. Air smelt of ozone and detergent, and the noise of train and bustling passengers made further announcements incomprehensible. Passengers had long given up trying to decipher station announcements and clutched pillows instead. Some time ago, when an announcement tried explaining that all services had been suspended as a result of drivers developing acute train allergies, passengers were forced to sleep on the underground platforms. As a consequence, there had been a determination to comprehend announcements from badly positioned loudspeakers in poorly chosen locations. But because the desperate shhs of those wishing to hear drowned out said announcements, passengers gave up and brought pillows instead. Struggling through flailing paws, the returned poet scrambled into the carriage and recommenced paw hopping. Embarking passengers watched him warily, worried he required a toilet long before he'd find one. He glared at them, aware of his tattered robes and knowing he hadn't washed for weeks. He closed his eyes and tried lessening his breaths, which were even more ragged than his attire. He willed the train to move. When it began to, he willed it to go faster, which it did. He stared at the roof, wishing for patience when his paw-hopping bordered on dance. He whimpered, trying to quell rising panic, which rose like bile in his throat. Concerned by his antics, passengers gave him such a wide berth that it encompassed the entire carriage. Relieved, he closed his eyes and forced his hopping to slow. When the train began slowing also, he stumbled to its door and tried opening it. A squeak of brakes taunted him until the train jolted to a stop. When doors hissed open, he ploughed through a tide of boarding animals before collapsing upon the platform amidst a storm of paws. He peered between them to be certain of the station's name. His relief at having arrived forged a determination on par with that of boarding passengers. He struggled upright and lunged towards stairs. At the top of them, 2 ticket inspectors waited, one of which intercepted him. "Excuse me, sir," a large uniformed dog asked, barring the way in a manner akin to walls. "May I see your ticket?" Although the returned poet halted, his aroma did not, which left the inspector retching when it continued past them. "May I see your ticket, please, sir?" Patting his tatters absent-mindedly, the returned poet realised not only was he devoid of one, but that he didn't care. The ticket inspector wasn't surprised. Having considerable experience inspecting tickets, he was adept at identifying fare evaders in the same way others identified colour. He'd been nominated for Ticket Inspector of the Year for an 8th year running. But having been thrown from a train by fare evaders recently, he'd failed to achieve the award for an 8th time and had instead been demoted to station duties, which had shattered his confidence into the sort of thing dustpans were invented for. The inspector folded his paws and glared. "So you don't have a ticket?" The returned poet shook his head, his desperation to arrive having left him oblivious to the necessities of doing so. "If you don't have a ticket," the inspector said, "then I shall afford you the opportunity to purchase one now. If you don't purchase one, then I shall have no choice but to reprimand you." The returned poet stared, his desperation leaving no room for decision-making. "Well," the inspector said,
Would you like to purchase a ticket now? Or would you prefer a reprimand? Reprimands can be nasty. There's swearing for a start. Certainly tickets are nicer.
Holding out his tatters to indicate he had no money, the returned poet was unable to believe he'd come so far to discover he needed a few coins for the last bit. He asked whether a reprimand would take long, as he had to be somewhere almost immediately, which the ticket inspector hoped might be a bath and wardrobe in that order.
I shall offer you a caution,
the inspector decided, pulling out a notebook and flicking through pages. He found an appropriate one and scribbled upon it, before tearing it off and holding it out. The returned poet took it and read, "Don't do it again. Tickets exist for a reason, you know. If I catch you evading a fare next time, then I shall get very cross indeed, all right?" The returned poet stared at it and him with bewilderment.
"You are fortunate,"
the inspector said, pocketing his book.
"I have spent the past few months in traction, which has made me seriously consider how much effort I should make regarding tickets. This, as you might imagine, leaves me in somewhat of a quandary, considering I'm a ticket inspector."
The returned poet nodded, seeing the dilemma at once.
"Should you find any money upon you at a later stage," he continued, "I insist that you return here and purchase a ticket in order to make amends, understood?"
After another nod, the inspector stepped aside.
"Go," he said, "before I change my mind and care."
After glancing at the remaining inspector, who watched with interest, the returned poet hurried from them and scurried up some more stairs. His desperation returned and he stumbled from the station and into the night. The second inspector approached the first. "How are you feeling?" he asked, unable to imagine the trauma of being thrown from a train, let alone miss out on Ticket Inspector of the Year for an 8th year running. The large dog sighed and wiped at a tear.
"Oh, you know," he said, "quite fine, except I don't seem to have any sarcasm anymore. And how can I be a ticket inspector if I don't have sarcasm?"
"Give it time," the second said, patting his shoulder. "You have to give these things time, you know. You've been through an awful lot recently, and I'm not just referring to traction. Being thrown from a train must be dreadful, let alone when thrown by fare evaders." There were some nods.
"It was pretty horrid, yes."
"You have to remind yourself of the ticket inspector's mantra. The moment tickets are no longer inspected is the moment that society needs them to be." The notebook was retrieved and fiddled with self-consciously.
"It's just, so disappointing. I could have had the title for an 8th year running."
There were some understanding nods from his colleague.
"It's not the title itself, you understand," he continued. "It's just encouraging to know that the ticketing board recognise that I'm good at inspecting tickets."
"But they know you're good at it. 7 times in a row is proof of the fact."
"Then why did I get thrown from a train? I'm used to inspecting the hardest, toughest railways in the world, not being thrown onto them."
Or perhaps it was slippery.
"And now I'm assigned to leave, where the only fare evaders are ones who catch the wrong train and end up here accidentally."
"Look, I'm certain the board just want you to recover properly, that's all. And once you have, I'm convinced they'll again assign you to the most dreadful routes imaginable. Before you know it, you'll be sarcastic and infuriating and ticketing fare evaders until your bum falls off."
"But that requires that I care."
The notebook sagged.
"And at the moment, I just don't."
"Give it time."
"Do you really think so?"
Another pat of shoulder. "Rudeness is like a plant," the second said. "It takes time to grow, and you've just been very heavily pruned." The city of Lieb was busy. The place bustled in amber haze beneath a night sky thick with cloud. Streets and pavements choked with fumes, honks and shouts as traffic attempted to move amongst pedestrians also vying to return home. Cars stopped and started, tending toward the former when pedestrians got in the way, and buses did the same with cars. Above it all, lamp posts lit their haste with a patience rare for the time of day. The city was known well to the returned poet because he was a poet. Liebe is known as the city of poets, having hosted the greatest recitals ever recited and being home to the greatest poets who'd ever lived. One building, in particular, epitomised the realm of poetry: the inaugural halls of Liebe, an institution having the greatest poetic licence since the things had been issued. It was where he'd learned his craft. Stumbling across pavement and into traffic, he battled its currents until reaching the opposite one. He hurried past pedestrians, ignoring their stares. He ignored the aromas of restaurants too, despite having not eaten for months. He rounded a corner and turned down a laneway, breath as ragged as his attire. When emerging from it, he skidded to a halt and stared. Across the street, upon a hill flanked by beautiful gardens, resided a magnificent mansion. Beneath cloud-heavy night, the building had sinister mass. Its sandstone walls shone in silver-black grime. Spires stretched towards sky like treacle, as though having been spun from the clouds they hung beneath. Pulling his tatters closer, he shivered, certain that brightness of day would render the place no less menacing. For those knowing little of rhyme, the inaugural halls of Liebe left them in awe of the craft, while those knowing something of it were left with an awe still greater. He hurried across the street and grasped railing. Beyond it, manicured lawn rose, blue where it sprawled and black where groves of tree round up from earth like claw and hair. The air had a weight of cold and smelt of wet branch and dead leaves, which rendered the scent of vibrant traffic suddenly more appealing. At a driveway, he squeezed through railings and hurried across gravel to a cover of trees. Through them, he peered up the hill until certain he hadn't been seen before scrambling across its lawns. Upon reaching the hill's crest, he cowered in hedges and trembled with despair and hope. After a breath for courage, he darted across the driveway and into an alcove where he reached for a metal knocker. He thumped at once upon a door. A boom echoed through space beyond. Having finally arrived, he slumped against stone, exhausted, and struggled to reconcile his desperate return to the place with the splendid years he'd spent studying in it. A latch shifted, and a bolt followed. He stumbled backwards, readying to beg and plead for all he was worth. The door opened to reveal a slither of cat, whose whiskers poked out along with a portion of paw. "The elder Splunnert Pomwimple," the returned poet whispered, unable to find volume. "I need to see him urgently." The cat said nothing. "Please, it is most urgent. I was a student of his many years ago. I pray he still resides within." "Is he expecting you?" The hesitation that followed was answer enough. "Unless he is expecting you," the cat said, the door no wider, "I cannot allow you to enter, regardless of how urgent your concerns may be. You will have to wait until a more sensible hour, when he is available in the halls, and make an appointment in the traditional manner, which involves both making an appointment and a more sensible hour." "Please, I assure you that my request is not for personal gain. I have something terribly pressing to advise." "And that is?" "I fear I cannot tell you, sir, but I beseech that you ask that he grant me a moment. He will be indebted, I can assure you." "Even so, I cannot. If you wish to speak to him, I have told you how you might do so. Good night." The door moved to close. "Wait!" cried the returned poet, lunging at it. "Please, look, I shall wait here. All I ask is that you pass one word on to the elder, and you will be asked to fetch me." "But he's having dinner," the cat said. "I can't disturb the elder Pomwimple when he's in the middle of dinner." "Mention this word to him, and you can be assured that he will have no appetite for what remains of it." The cat sighed. "And the word?" the returned poet whispered. "The creed." "The what?" "The creed." "I can't hear you, you're whispering." "I know, and I'm sorry, but it's such a terribly dangerous word." "And yet you wish me to utter it?" "Just mention it to him, please. I shall wait here. I can assure you that he'll demand my presence." "Creed," the cat repeated, to be sure. "The creed." "What, the creed?"
"Yes."
"So it is in fact two words?"
"What?"
"It's two words that you want me to mention."
Well, does it matter?"
"Well, of course it matters. You're asking me to disturb the most esteemed pivotal elder of the inaugural halls of Lee with an assortment of words, and during dinner no less, so I'd rather think it does.
It's not an assortment of words. It's just two, and one of them isn't that important.
Which one's that then?
What?
Which one is the less important word?
Well, isn't it obvious?
Well, none of this is obvious. The returned poet stared.
The first one, the. Yes.
And what was the second one again?
Creed.
The creed.
The returned poet nodded. Please, I beg you, mention both to the elder.
Well, I haven't agreed to mention either yet.
Please, I implore you.
I mean, that's almost a sentence.
Please, Cat.
In fact, I'm quite certain it is a sentence. If you'd asked, can you mention one sentence, rather than swamping me in an assortment of words, some of which aren't even important, we could probably have avoided all this confusion and the elder's dinner need not be threatened in the first place.
The returned poet felt blood rise in panic.
It's cauliflower cheese, the cat said, his deliberation apparent, which is the elder's favourite. So if I'm going to interrupt him, it'd better be worth it. One word, possibly, but not a sentence.
More stares.
So I shall mention the second word only, the cat decided. Just think yourself lucky it's only one syllable.
Please, mention both.
I can't, it's cauliflower cheese.
You need to mention both.
Why?
The returned poet stared so much that his eyes hurt. For support.
Support?
He nodded. The second word is so dire that the first must be included to help lessen the shock when uttering it. Should you mention the latter without the former, the elder may well bring up whatever portion of cauliflower cheese he's already consumed. The cat was aghast.
You wish me to make the elder Pomwimple vomit? Well, that's hardly helping your argument.
Please! The door was opened more, and the cat studied him.
Only if you admit it's a sentence.
What?
Admit that it's a sentence, and I'll have a bit more of a think about it.
Why do I need to admit it's a sentence?
Because I have but a lowly role in this most esteemed institution. I'm responsible for mops and doors, you see, for which I'm grateful, of course, but if you're supposedly a poet, and I've just recognised a sentence when you haven't, then your admission to such oversight would make me feel a great deal better about being lowly.
Yes, it's a sentence, but it doesn't matter.
You're the poet, the cat said, so it fluffing well ought to.
When the door closed, the returned poet released a breath he'd been unaware of holding. He turned to the gardens. Their manicured blue was ominous, the night having surgically carved the grounds and rendered them bruised. He shrank against the alcove and waited. The inaugural halls of Lee were huge, so it would take some time for the elder to be sought. He waited. There would be time for the shock to dissipate and the elder to find words. He'd tremble perhaps, go a strange colour and probably gag. He'd throw his meal of food aside and demand the messenger be fetched directly. The returned poet smoothed his tatters in anticipation. He'd be ushered into a reading room where, in the presence of the venerable Elder Pomwimple, he'd surrender a burden that threatened to crush the world. Still, he waited. After a time, he wondered if the cat had done anything at all. He knocked again. There was another shift of latch and a slide of bolt before the slither of cat reappeared. An inquiring blink left the returned poet stunned, he had to ask. Well? The Elder Pomwimple, did you find him?
I did, yes.
And?
The cat shrugged. But I mentioned the word, both of them actually, and then in reverse order to make quite certain. But the pivotal elder was entirely indifferent.
The returned poet stared as the door began to close. Wait! He pleaded, a paw upon it. Pomwimple! Splanet Pomwimple! The esteemed pivotal elder herein. That was who you mentioned both words to.
Yes, and he wasn't bothered with either of them.
A weight of despair pressed at his lungs. But what? He reacted not at all. The cat shrugged again.
Well, I noticed him hesitate, but then he continued slurping. Oh, that was it, really.
He asked nothing of why such words were brought to him? The cat shook his head. But there must be some mistake. He pressed at the door. You didn't pronounce them clearly enough. Or perhaps you whispered too quietly.
Not at all. I have rather good diction, as it happens. It's a prerequisite for employment within the inaugural halls of Liebe. I'm also very good with mops,
quite good with buckets and know an awful lot about doors.
The returned poet's stare became all-consuming. He'd expected shock, not indifference. He'd anticipate the elder gasp with horror and flail in a desperate bid to know everything. "Something is wrong," he whispered, before pushing at the door. "Let me in! I must see him!" The cat barred his way.
"No chance. I've done what you've asked and no one appears to care. The elder Pomwimple is not interested in your words and is now busy with pudding. That is an end to it."
He looked the dog up and down.
"And what's more, your attire is hardly befitting a poet of Liebe, if indeed you are one at all, considering your inability to identify sentences. On the account of your clothes alone, you shall not enter this place."
The returned poet forced the door with a shoulder. "Regardless of attire, cat, who is larger, you or I?" The cat barred it with effort.
"It matters little,"
he growled.
"You shan't enter, and you certainly will not disturb the elder."
"I do not believe you have even sought him. You have done no more than play games of tease with dangers you cannot begin to imagine."
"Excuse me," the cat said, "but I have done exactly as you asked. I even swapped the words around. I can't help it if the elder's more interested in pudding. And what's more, I don't need to imagine anything. This is your madness, not mine. Now leave before I get cross."
The returned poet felt night close in, its dark pressed, and reminded him of what he'd fled. If his teacher was in denial, then the world was already lost. With a growl, he threw himself at the door. It shifted, and there was a frantic scrabble at bolts behind it. "I shall be in soon enough, cat," he growled. "So I advise you to step away or be torn apart once I do." After another lunge, the bolts were surrendered. When the door opened, the cat stepped back, saying, "You shan't get away with this, you know. No animal barges into the inaugural halls of Liebe without some pretty dire consequences, I can assure you." The returned poet didn't hear, besotted by a vestibule he'd once known well. Its floor remained as he'd remembered, with thick carpets across polished stone, while ceilings towered over columns supporting a colossal web of black beam. Lamps glowed from recesses within cathedral-like walls, between which rugs cascaded, their fabric stained with centuries of incense that left the air potent, mature, and wise.
"Did you hear what I said about dire consequences?"
"I fear, cat," he whispered, staring at its height. "Such consequences are already upon us all." While the cat ranted about security arrangements and mops, the returned poet revelled in nostalgia until the cat mentioned cauliflower cheese again. "Which dining room?" he demanded. The cat had armed himself with a mop and bucket.
"Which what?"
"Which dining room is the elder in? There are over 30 in this vestibule alone."
"I'm not telling you," the cat said, sloshing his bucket threateningly. "You shouldn't even be in here. I'm responsible for doors, you know, and having poorly attired animals barge through them has rendered my tenure of the role dubious."
When the returned poet marched closer, the cat retreated.
"Don't even think of hitting me," he cried, waving his mop. "I'm also very good with this, which you'll find out if you get any closer."
After another growl, the returned poet turned and hurried across the vestibule. The cat called after him, waving his mop and shouting things about security and unconventional mop usage. At the far end was a broad sweep of staircase in a glacier of marble, up which the returned poet leapt until arriving at a landing as elegant as the hall downstairs. Corridors led from it, and he spun around, trying to recall which one led to dining rooms. Choosing one, he hurried along it, turning at some corners and ignoring others. He stumbled through a large doorway and into a library, which he hurried through also, ignoring two surprised elders reading in it. After careering through more doors, he transgressed a reading room, 3 sitting rooms, a second library and a cheese room, before bursting into a large dining room where 3 elders were eating pudding. 2 of them looked up in surprise. The third, however, did not. With breath lost somewhere near the second sitting room, the returned poet stared at him. The elder Splunnett Pomwimple, his teacher, his mentor, the pivotal elder of the inaugural halls of Liebe, and apparently unperturbed at having a mad, tattered dog burst into dining rooms during pudding. With a surge of hope, the returned poet stepped forward, But with breath still elsewhere, he was unable to find words.
Elder Pomwimple,
he cried when it arrived, his paws clasped in plead as much as apology. The dog did not look up and remained engaged with pudding. The returned poet glanced at the others, both of which stared at him.
Where's the custard?
One asked.
Elder Pomwimple,
The returned poet said, ignoring them.
I must speak with you. It's terribly urgent.
Still, Pomwimple ate. The others didn't.
Did you bring more custard? Because I can't see any custard.
He turned to his colleague.
Can you see any custard?
The other shook his head that he could not.
Where's the custard?
Still ignoring them, the returned poet took another step, hesitating to mention the words lest the elders spray pudding across the table. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath and said,
I must speak with you regarding the creed.
When he opened them, the elder continued to slurp.
Did you hear me, elder? I speak of the creed.
A deliberate licking of spoon. Astonished, the returned poet asked,
How can you ignore my mentioning the word? I speak of the creed, no less.
Still nothing other than the other two demanding custard.
You must help me, elder. I have been stolen for years, yet have found myself returned this day with barely a week having passed. We are trapped, elder, all of us. Your greatest students, stolen from this world and forced to work upon the creed.
Still nothing.
How could you just ignore me?
I know nothing of which you speak.
The words were heavy and felt like granite. The returned poet stared.
You know nothing of it,
he whispered, taking another step.
You know nothing of the creed? Nothing of the enslaved poets?
I know nothing of which you speak, dog.
The elder growled, staring at his pudding.
I know nothing of your creeds or your slaves. You speak in riddles. This is a hallowed hall of verse, and I do not take kindly to it being invaded by vagrants who believe they have tendencies in the craft.
He glanced at his colleagues, who agreed, before demanding custard. A weight of despair descended, and breath again left. Something was wrong. The elder had once encouraged his studies. That he now refused to acknowledge them was devastating. Without the elder's help, those enslaved would remain trapped, and the world would invert as a consequence.
You deny me?
He whispered through tears.
You deny what you once taught?
When the elder returned to his pudding, the cat in charge of doors arrived with security. Blinded by desperation, the returned poet collapsed to his knees.
Tell me, elder, do you also deny the Morrigan?
The elder threw his chair backwards and stood.
Do not mention such names herein!
Everyone froze. Silence fell, and the returned poet's hope surged. One of the other elders stood also.
Dog,
he said,
not only have you failed to bring custard, but you distress our colleague. He has already admitted knowing nothing of your cause, so I suggest you leave now, lest your tatters become more so and unable to cover you at all.
When security flanked him, the returned poet ignored them too, not interested in the fate of his attire. He'd risked his life to find the elder and wouldn't surrender easily. When security grabbed him, he fought their grasp.
They write the creed, he cried. The enslaved poets write under the duress of the Morrigan. You know it to be true. You told us this would come to pass. You of all animals can imagine the horrors the Morrigan is readying. You must help us, Elder Pomwimple. You must, before the world becomes theirs.
To this, the elder smashed a paw at his half-finished pudding. The bowl scattered across the table and fell to the floor. Seething, he turned and approached.
There is nothing I can do for you, dog.
He growled.
Nothing. I know nothing of your creed, or the 7 of whom you speak. I know nothing of your poets enslaved, nor of the world being under duress. Is that understood?
The returned poet's hope surged further.
That you mention them by number proves you know them. You deny them because of fear. Well, I have seen them, Elder. For years I've remained crushed beneath their will. If you refuse to help, then rest assured you'll choke upon denial when the world crumbles beneath their rule. In disgust, the elder turned back to the table and ordered the dog's expulsion. Despite further protests, the returned poet was dragged from the room. While the elder stood and seethed, the cat in charge of doors slunk forward to retrieve the bowl before scraping splattered pudding off the floor into it. After returning it to the table, he apologized for having permitted such disturbance and asked whether it meant he was no longer in charge of doors. The elders ignored him. "Do you know that animal?" one asked, helping Pomwimple back to the chair.
I have no idea, truly,
the elder whispered. He sat and flapped a napkin as though it was the reason he'd stood in the first place. Why, in the name of verse, would he mention fables of creeds and morrigans? The other asked. To this, Pomwimple did not reply, knowing the answer only too well. Thank you for listening to When Fear Is Not Afraid, the fourth Velvet Paw of Asquith novel by Thomas Caulfield. Editing by Stephanie Mills, music by JCMP, engineering by Michael Teo and produced by Andrew Cameron. Visit velvetpawofasquith.com to learn more about the books and thomascaulfield.com to insult him about them.